I'm waiting on camera one. Oh, there's camera one. So that's to the right, that's the left. Hey, we are live. Look, and I can hear myself talking. Tina is on. Good afternoon. And shared. Hey, folks, we are live. We're actually trying to get a camera angle set up. We have a pretty cool show for you today, so I'm just kind of being patient, standing here, listening to myself talk. And here's something really, really cool. I can actually hear myself in my ear because I have an earpiece on. So, folks, jumping on the live stream, we'll give them just a second. Are we set up, ready to go? And camera angle one is good. Camera angle two. Camera angle three. Camera angle one is cutting the top of my head off. So we might want to adjust that one just slightly. So, all right, folks, I'm going to rock and roll. Go to a different camera angle for now. Welcome to the Facebook Live. My name is Mike Seeklander. We have a pretty good show and some exciting news. We actually have our first ever guest on the show. I'll talk about him here in just a second. But as always, I want to remind you of a few things. And of course, I'm very organized today, so I have my notes. And the first thing is safety. So, of course, if we are doing any kind of dry fire today, I want to make sure that you completely and totally follow all safety rules. So if you're going to dry fire, if you're going to handle any firearm whatsoever, please make sure that firearm is unloaded and clear, and you have a safe backstop and a safe dry fire backstop, and you follow all other safety rules. So please do me a favor, check your guns right now. Of course, I've got a table full of guns here. I actually have a couple that are converted with Cool Fire trainer kits. You can see that red and that silver barrel, which is kind of cool because it allows me to pull the trigger and I actually get slide cycling felt recoil. And by the way, the Cool Fire trainer, if you go to coolfiretrainer.com, they are today's show sponsors. So I have Cool Fire converted Beretta 92 made by Wilson. I've got a Cool Fire converted Glock 19 that's gassed up as well. We've got a good old SIRT pistol made by Next Level Training, and then a variety of other live firearms if we want to talk about the subject for today with a 1911 style system or a SIG 320 style system or whatever else. So please check your firearms if you haven't done so already. Now, if you're an old follower, not old like literally old, but old school, like you've been following me for a long time, you know that I'm going to ask you to click the share or the like button to please let people know we're on live. Of course, Tuesday afternoon at 1 p.m. Central Time is a little different time than normal, so please click the share button, share it to a couple groups or whatever else. Who do we have on right now? We have a bunch of people on. Oh my gosh. Mark Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Good morning. Afternoon. How many times am I going to say good morning? I'm too used to good morning. Steve Miller, number 1536. That's Steve's coin number, by the way. Rich Alloway. Good morning, Frick. Good afternoon, Rich. How are you doing? Nice to see you, man. Frederick Strom. Oh my gosh, from Sweden. We have Sweden in the house. Sheila. Hello, Sheila. Good afternoon. IDPA is in the house as well. Jim H. from Dayton, Ohio. Nice to see you, Jim. Pat Cahill's on as well. Vincent Crow. Hi, Vincent. Outstanding. It looks like a few of you have shared as well. The cool thing about this is that our main heavy-hitting programmer, Brock, has programmed and done some sort of coding to allow me to see both your comments and your names as well, which is pretty darn cool. And by the way, Pat, your coin number 2446. All right, folks, if you are on LiveFire, do me a favor, open the app and send me a message and give me a follow, and I will follow you back. If you're not on the app, the LiveFire app, you should scan the QR code that we're going to show here in a second with your phone, download, and at least check out the free trial. It's a pretty cool app, firearms training, very, very robust, and all kinds of things, including a social feed. And this week on the LiveFire app, I released the weekly programming, which I've been doing for, 6 weeks now? And this week's drill or programming is one I call AC/DC. I'm not going to tell you why it's called AC/DC, and it's a pretty cool drill. Every week we do a new drill or piece of content, i.e. programming, that you can utilize to train and practice and test your skill. Of course, the only way to experience LiveFire is to download it and check it out. And trust me, it is pretty darn impressive. So scan that QR code. Also, a couple more things. We've got some pretty neat features coming up. We have a new groups feature coming up sometime in the very near future. We've got a social media release that I can't tell you the details about. That's super exciting because, to be honest with you, current social media to me is to an extent a cesspool. And I know I'm on Facebook Live right now. I appreciate you, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook. But the point is, we're trying to create an environment and a place where people can go to where everybody can share their love. Okay. Now let's talk about today's guest, and we'll bring him on the show, and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about. Mr. Keith Garcia is going to be coming on the show. He's our first in-stream LiveFire guest. So I'm pretty excited about this. I actually haven't had a guest on the screen with me. Keith is retired after 30 years in law enforcement. The guy is a beast in multi-gun, three-gun, handgun shooting, phenomenally talented, skilled, did many, many years of instruction, and a guy that I personally have known for many years, and I trust what he says. And when we talked about this show several weeks ago, Keith said, hey, I want to talk about trigger control 101, because it is the holy grail of shooting. So let's bring Keith on the show, and we'll start talking about trigger control. Hello, Keith. How are you?
Mike, how are you?
I'm great, man. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. I retired, so every day is wonderful now.
It's a blessing, man. Well, so nice to have you on the show. We're going to be talking about Trigger Control 101. But before we do that, I just gave a couple snippets of your bio. Tell us a little bit more about your bio, your background. Let these live viewers know who you are.
So luckily, I was able to get through a 30-year career in law enforcement here in California. About 15 years of that was spent on a SWAT team, and been teaching for quite a while. I've been fortunate enough to teach in the Sheriff's Department Police Academy since 2004, continuing on with that. And after retirement, I started my own company. It's LTAC, Libra Training and Consulting. And I'm going to get out there and hopefully tour the country and bring a lot of these good tips and tricks that we're going to talk about today to people live and in person.
Outstanding. Well, welcome to the show, man. And when I reached out to you and you responded, you said, Mike, I want to talk about trigger control. And I'm going to be honest with you, with a guy with your level of experience, I was surprised. I'm like, oh, trigger control, that seems like a pretty basic fundamental thing. And in the way your text read, it was like, hey, this is not the secret of shooting, because as you said, grip and stance and structure all relate, but it's really an incredible important piece of the pie. So let's talk about it. Let's take it away, man. And by the way, we've got a bunch of people on right now. I don't know how many live viewers total. I know we got Arizona in the house. We got British Columbia. We got Newark, New Jersey. Knoxville, number 197. I love that. Canada is in the house as well. Missouri, 1536. And by the way, Keith, when I'm saying these numbers, these are our American Warrior Society coin member numbers. And we got LiveFire members on as well, and probably some of my competitive shooters. So Keith, take it away, man. Tell me about trigger control. I've got some guns here I can pick up. I can manipulate. Tell me what to do.
All right, so let's just do a little bit of pretext here. Once you get past safety, in my mind, the most important thing you can do is actually learn the proper trigger mechanics to be successful in shooting. Everything else we do besides that, balance, stance, grip, is just going to enhance it. It's going to make it better. But until we can fire that perfect shot and isolate the action of the trigger finger and keep the barrel on the target, everything else is just extraneous. So I developed this because teaching in the police academy, I have the opportunity to meet with a lot of young people who have never shot, and a lot of people who have had friends and family teach them things that were maybe not ideal, and their trigger control is really poor. And in the academy where I work, we have a pretty stringent testing process, and you have to be able to shoot. And we all know that shooting is not rocket science, but unless you can do this part and isolate the action of that trigger finger and understand how the trigger works, then you're going to have a harder time passing the test. So what I like to do is break them down to the basic components and do really a workup in how the trigger operates and what they need to do to be successful. So when people think about trigger work, trigger control, A lot of people starting off in shooting have gone through some military training or maybe some law enforcement training where they were taught what I call traditional marksmanship. They're going to pull that trigger, slow squeeze to the rear, let the gun go off, pin it, then release it to reset. In that, the first part, great, slow, steady press, I'm good with. Pinning it to the rear and letting it out slowly. What I see in teaching new shooters is that it just builds up anxiety.
So let me interrupt you real quickly, Keith. When you're talking about the stages of the trigger, could you walk me through and let me actually make contact with the trigger so you can define what you're talking about? Because I think we use pretty much the exact same terms, but I want the audience to be able to, to see what I'm doing as well. So talk to me through the stages of trigger.
Okay, so once we get the proper grip, balance, stance, we're up on target. What I talk them through in my warm up and when I'm teaching is I want the first 10 draw strokes or the first presentations from high ready. I don't even want them contacting the trigger. I just want them to come up, see those sights, get them on the target.
Okay.
The next 10 presentations, I want you to touch the trigger, but I don't want you to put any pressure.
Okay, so literally touch, but no prep. Okay.
Correct. The next 10, I want you to touch the trigger, take up that pre-travel all the way to the wall, which we're going to call prep.
Okay, so give me that term one more time.
Pre-travel?
Yeah, pre-travel. So do you call that prepping the trigger?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we did 10 reps of aiming the gun, just presentation. We did 10 reps where we just literally touched the trigger. And now I'm going to do some reps of taking the slack out of the trigger. So here's the question for you at that point in time. I would assume these are dry fire reps?
These are, but we also have a live fire addition to it. But with your gun, we can go into the live fire part of it.
Okay, well, so my first question, when they're doing the initial prep, is how often do students shoot without meaning to shoot? I call that an early discharge, whatever, or dry fire without meaning to, because they don't truly understand the amount of pressure the trigger requires to prep it versus fire it. Do you have that happen as well?
Yeah, great question, because I want them to do that to understand how much pressure they can put on the trigger. Because then I know they're actually trying. They're not just simulating putting pressure on the trigger, because a lot of times, especially students in large groups, maybe they don't get it and they're going through the motion, or they're looking at the student next to them to see what they're doing. So if they go too far and actually release the striker or the hammer, then I understand, okay, you are trying to take it to the wall. You went a little too far, but now you'll just learn something. That's where it is. That's where you're actually going to release the striker or the hammer. Let's try to get to that spot without doing it.
Yeah. So if I make that mistake and oops, I pull that trigger and I didn't mean to pull the trigger, that becomes probably the best lesson of the day. I realize, okay, I'm trying to prep the trigger, but I over prep the trigger and had too much pressure, which allows you to fix that as the instructor. Say, okay, let's just learn the pressure on the trigger, right?
Correct. Because if you don't get to that point, then you're just kind of faking it because you don't really understand what's going on. It's easy to pick up at that point. And what we see obviously with newer shooters is all these little fine motor movements with the finger. They're not getting that right away. And this way, before they start shooting, if I show them these mechanics, then they start to learn that, okay, there are different parts of the trigger. Because as soon as you put ammo in that gun with a new shooter, all of it goes out the window. So the dry fire portion of this is critical. We do a whole day before we even get out to the range, the first day in the academy, where we're going to, out of an 8-hour day, they're going to literally shoot about 40 rounds, but it's going to be in the last hour. The first 6 hours plus a lunch is going to be just working on safety and working on breaking down how this trigger works.
Man, I love that. In my 2-day program, competition, defense, anybody I teach, to be honest with you, I rarely go live fire until afternoon. I've done structure, and I talk about exactly what you're talking about. And we go through the stages of the trigger, touch the trigger, prep the trigger. Okay, then eventually we get to the point where I'm going to have them fire the gun and then do what's next. Of course, I don't want to talk about that because I don't want to steal your thunder, but I love that process. And by the way, folks, if you're watching right now, Mike Seeklander live streaming. I've got Keith Garcia on. We're talking about Trigger Control 101. You can throw your comments up there if you want, please. Click the share button. Let other folks know we're on. If you want to send a text message or share it to a group or whatever else, that would be greatly appreciated. And by the way, if you have a question and somehow I miss it, we kind of have a unique commenting system here. Please throw it back up there again. Just copy and paste it and throw it back up in the comments again, because we want to make sure that Keith has the opportunity to answer your question. And Keith, I do have a question from one of the viewers right now. I'm not sure if you saw that, from Vincent Crow. Is this trigger prep drill intended to train to pass a qualifier, to train for competition, or to train for defensive shooting? So give me, or give the audience your opinion on trigger control as it relates to all of the spectrums. Defensive, which would be, your police officers as well. Competitive, is it different? Or is trigger control the same?
So for me personally, having been in law enforcement for a very long time and been a competitive shooter for a very long time, I know that this foundation is applicable to both, as well as concealed carry, personal defense situations. You need to learn how to pull the trigger straight to the rear without moving the gun dramatically if you're going to either be successful in law enforcement, in a conflict, or in competition. So this is to build the mechanics to pull the trigger correctly, as opposed to jumping in and just trying to hold the gun really tightly, or trying to force the, when I went to the academy, when you shoot low left, they said aim high right, things like that. It's, we've come a long way, luckily, but
yeah.
This, to me, learning the mechanics of the trigger and being able to pull that trigger straight to the rear is applicable to all scenarios, rifle, pistol, and shotgun. When you're applying it, whether it's law enforcement, it's personal defense, or competition.
Cool. And by the way, we have a bunch of folks on. We have looks like David Habig joined us from Arkansas. Welcome. And of course, I just saw Frank, saw the last name, but it disappeared on me. Jump on as well. Hey, it looks like Betty Orr's on. That's my mother. So welcome to the show. Keith, say hi to my mom. Yeah. Jan Martin is on. Jan Bailey Martin. Good morning. How are you? And
Jan,
says, hello. Hi, Keith Garcia.
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to Jan. I was fortunate enough to be with her on the range at the NSSF Ambassador Academy in Florida in January. February. And we had a great time. Great student.
Yeah. Cool. Very, very well. All right. So we're talking about trigger control. You actually had me going through some simple exercises: pointing the gun, touching the trigger, pointing the gun, prepping the trigger. Tell me what's next.
So now we're going to do 10 reps where we actually release the striker or the hammer.
Okay.
And in dry fire, obviously that's the complete rep. But I would like in that case, I want the student to go through all those. Got an empty gun here. Okay. In that process, I want to go through. I want to bring the sights up, aligned with my eye. I want to touch the trigger. I want to physically take out that slack in the trigger. And then I want to make a conscious decision to feel the rest of that press all the way through before the striker releases. And if they're able to break all those down for me in dry fire, and actually talk me through it, a little teach back of what they're doing and what they're feeling. And if they can feel that portion where it's really light, the pre-travel is really light. I hit the wall. Right. And now as I push through that wall, I'm feeling different stages in that release of the striker or the hammer. Because we all know there's various amounts of pressure that need to be applied to the trigger before it actually releases the striker or the hammer. So once they start getting that feeling and they can explain it and teach it back, then I see that they start to understand the proper mechanics. And the more they do that, the better off their subconscious is going to be when we put live ammo. When we introduce live ammo in the scenario and the subconscious starts taking over with the, oh no, there's going to be this concussion and this flash and this pressure event on my body. I want them to be ready for that, but I also want them to have the understanding that the more they've done this in dry fire, the easier the live fire is going to be.
Sure. So once you go to the live fire series of repetitions, if I've done my skill building sessions, I've presented the gun, touched the trigger, prepped the trigger, now I'm going to fire the gun. What's the next step in the process there? And I would assume
I'm going to get in close to the camera so I can show you.
Do that.
Initially, what I'm going to do with this, with them, is have them come off right when the gun goes off under recoil, come off and then back to the wall. Okay. I'm not trying to hunt for that reset. What I find is when they're pinned to the rear and they slowly let it out, this whole time I'm slowly letting it out. The anxiety's building. Where's that click?
Yes.
And they literally slam the trigger right when they get the click.
Yeah,
And
I
that causes,
completely agree. Their timing is off at that point in time versus just and like with the cool fire, fire the shot, release the trigger, and then re-prep it. So here's a question for you, Keith. When you're releasing the trigger, do you lose contact with the trigger? Do you, and or what do you teach your students?
initially I tell them it's okay to lose contact. If they need to physically get out a little bit to release it, to reinforce it with themselves. And as we go on through the process, I would like to see them try and keep contact with the trigger. And that's more like that movement that I'm showing there. But it's okay for me. Probably I've seen my triggers in slow motion and fast, up close stuff, and I will slap the trigger because that's just the way it is, when we start going quick. But what I really want to see is them the ability to get back to that wall in a fast, consistent manner without that second shot going off.
Yeah, I love that. So, when we're talking about resetting the trigger and feeling all these processes, number one, I like that, which is why I dry fire with my students in class. And, full disclosure, and I think the most people probably viewing this have heard me say this. I lose contact with the trigger on most shots, even when I'm not slapping. And Keith, I think it's because I've taught on so many different platforms across the board. I know that if I release and lose contact, I guarantee I'll reset any trigger. Depending on, and it really doesn't matter what the trigger length or trigger reset length is. I won't short stroke it or whatever else. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I don't tell my students it's right or wrong as well. But you address a term, and I want you to address it for the audience as well, and then we'll do some Q&A. You said in video, when you slow motion yourself shooting fast, you're slapping the trigger, as everyone is. They're doing this with their trigger finger. But of course, in the community, oftentimes we hear, well, that's wrong. You shouldn't be slapping or jerking the trigger. I think you and I are both pretty good shooters, so we can argue that. But what would you respond with on slapping the trigger, or just what I call accelerating through the trigger?
So on close targets, when you're going fast, like you said, everyone's going to do it. Now, learning the trigger mechanics and understanding when I'm pulling when I actually prep the trigger and pull it from that second digit or the second knuckle as opposed to the first, I can do this pretty fast, and I can slap the trigger and keep it for these non-technical shots, I'm going to call them. Let's say out to 7 yards, I got a full size A zone. I can go fast on those targets. I will slap the trigger because I know that I'm not shooting a technical shot. Now, if we get out to a 15-yard headshot only, 25-yard plate rack, something where it calls for a little bit more trigger control, a little more technical shot, that same flip and press here gets me back to the wall, where then I can get the sight picture necessary for the target size and distance, and give it the proper attention and trigger control to let that shot go in the appropriate speed. Because that really,
right.
Go ahead.
Do you agree with the statement that the accuracy comes from the process of pulling the trigger, and of course what your fingers are doing while that's happening? Speed comes from, on a harder shot at least, comes from the process of resetting and getting back to the wall, just like you referred to.
100%. And that's why I get away from the traditional marksmanship, because when you're trying to prep the trigger, when you're pinning the trigger and then letting it out, it's also a slower process. This is going to be much faster to get back to that spot where I can fire a more technical shot than it is.
Here's the unique thing. Rob and I talk about this all the time. As you know, I teach classes with Rob Latham sometimes. And I don't know, when we say traditional marksmanship, that pull the trigger, pin it, hold it to the rear. I hate to even say that's traditional marksmanship, but I know it was traditionally what was taught in a lot of academies, and maybe it came from Glock as they transitioned over and had to teach revolver shooters how to re-prep the trigger. But it shouldn't be traditional, because the bottom line is, if you fired the gun, you should get ready to fire the gun again. If you're pulling the trigger to the rear and holding it there, you're just wasting time, right?
Correct. And that's that time to release the trigger slowly to the wall. I mean, it's a detriment, whether it's rifle, pistol, or shotgun. You're then taking extra time to release it. And in my mind, your subconscious is saying, and your conscious mind, oh, I got to find that spot. And when I find it, whether you want to or not, a lot of times the result is this. That you just automatically pull it because you want to, we want to have the satisfaction of firing that shot. So as soon as we get there, we think it's good to fire it as soon as the trigger's ready. But you save time and you save effort by going out past that reset point and coming back to it.
Yeah, and Sheila had a good question. Says, how is that different from slopping the trigger? One of the things that I would answer to Sheila and let you weigh in as well, Keith, is we have all these terms, jerk or slap or press or push or pull, and they're literally just words. But if we break down the trigger control that we're talking about, anything where for me, I have an accelerated pull and a control pull. My accelerated pull is literally an acceleration through the trigger, what you might have called a slap, and a control pull is one where I've slowed down and I've prepped the trigger because the gun requires additional aiming. Like that, the reason we're prepping the trigger, like you said earlier, is because that shot requires more attention, not because we want to feel the wall. Right? Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. I want to get back to a spot where I can pay attention, give the trigger enough attention to fire the shot that's at hand. Whether the target size and distance is easy or hard, I need to give it the proper respect. Yeah. To me, that's the ultimate goal of this, is to understand, and we don't know that till we do the practical application, but we must respect target size and distance. And when we finally figure out how much respect we give this to that target, then we know how fast we can shoot pretty much anything within a handgun range.
Yeah. And folks, by the way, if you're just joining us, my name is Mike Seeklander. I'm joined by Keith Garcia, incredibly talented shooter, 3-gun shooter, multi-gun handgun, former law enforcement officer, as well as instructor. We're talking about trigger control 101. So if you're on, please do me a favor, click the share button and try to get as many viewers as we can in front of the camera, or the screen, I should say. And also, if you have a question or something you want to ask, because I know I'm going to ask Keith some more questions as well, please type it up in the comments and send it back up there again if I miss it. We have a little bit of a challenge in terms of our commenting system. Sometimes I miss them if we have a lot of people commenting. So if you have a question, please put it up there. Click the like button. Once again, thanks for joining us on this live show. So I get to ask the first question, Keith, for you. Trigger finger position, because you already referred to the isolation of this joint versus this joint. Where do you believe the best trigger finger trigger position is? Like, where should I make contact with the trigger and why?
Oh, it'd be great if we had a universal answer to that question, but hand size is huge. The size of the gun, the size of your hands, the length of your fingers definitely will affect trigger finger placement. For me, I have relatively good size hands. So from this position here, if you see my trigger finger is now bent solely at that second joint. So when I pull the trigger and release it, I'm actually moving from that second joint. And my trigger finger is just going to be, mid swirl on the actual first pad, because then I can pull straight to the rear. I don't go in. That would be the first joint there. This would be the tip. Neither of those work for me. For me, it's right here, mid first pad, so I can operate that trigger straight to the rear.
100%. I completely agree. I'm in exactly the same position. Do you find that your finger may go to a slightly different spot depending on the speed you're pulling trigger? Here's why I asked the question. This is a great example. I've got a CERT 320 demonstration tool handgun. And I find that when I'm pulling the trigger fast, really fast, when I go really fast, my finger tends to slide out more toward the tip. Now, I don't change the position much, but tends to move a little bit. Full disclosure, this little laser, my dog likes to chase the laser around. So the faster I pull the trigger, the more the dog likes it. And that's what I figured that out. I know I should take things more serious, but what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I completely agree because I see myself and I've seen it in slow motion photography. So when I really think I can, I'm going to fire fast splits, El Pres or something, I'm up close and I want to really get on it, I will see myself dip into the further out onto the finger. And I feel like, I don't know if that's a safety blanket or if it actually is faster that way, but I know that that tends to happen when I'm trying to get some faster splits and move the gun a little quicker.
Yeah, I love that. So Mr. John Renanon, he's one of my members, says, describe the difference in trigger prep between striker fired and 1911, right? So I've got a safe and clear firearm here, okay? And I've got a safe and clear 1911, of course, where I've got a manual safety. So Keith, in your opinion, describe the difference in prep between a 1911 and, maybe a striker fired system.
These guns, striker fire systems are really easy and ideal for demonstrating these, but every gun's going to have a little bit of pre-travel before you engage let's say the sear in a 2011 or a 1911. And that little bit of pre-travel is what we're talking about. When we take that prep up, I'm going to make contact and take it up to that wall. And every trigger has a little bit in there, unless you've done some crazy stuff to an aftermarket trigger where there is no prep, and then you're basically dealing with a revolver at that point because it's all.
Do you like that? I don't like a no prep handgun trigger.
Oh,
I like a no prep maybe rifle trigger. But what are your thoughts on that?
Oh no, I need to have a little bit of prep because that gives me control. So when I make that contact, when I'm training, I make that contact. I take up the slack to the wall, and then in real life, this is all going to happen. Tenths of a second or hundredths of a second, but I have the control to take it up to the wall. At that point, now I'm in control of when the gun goes off, and I can place the shots where I want them, as opposed to not knowing when the gun's going to go off. Because I want to know, when I reach that point, you talk about surprise break, but as we shoot long enough, we kind of have an idea, within the 99.99% when that gun's going to go off, and you're not really surprised because you're doing everything right.
Yeah, I like that. There shouldn't be a surprise break in theory. So I have another question that I'll ask from Ed. But before that, because we're talking about that subject, contrast handgun with rifle. In a rifle, we may have.
I'm going to grab the rifle.
Stage trigger. Yeah, grab a rifle. Me too. We'll both grab some awesome rifles here. Check this bad boy out. Whoa, nice. I am unloaded and clear, sir. Looks like you are as well. So, Keith, when we're talking about trigger prep, correct me if any terminology is different than you use. A single stage rifle triggers typically no prep. You make contact with the wall right away. A two-stage rifle has a little bit of prep. So I'd be curious, which is your preference? Because for me, uniquely enough, this is the Wilson Combat 3-gun trigger, right? So basically, it has some roll to it, which allows me to reset the trigger fast, but it doesn't have any slack like true prep. So
I understand what you're saying, and I understand a lot of people like that in a rifle. I personally still like the same amount of trigger control and the same breakdown. So this is an AR Gold from American Trigger Corporation, and you'll notice I have slack. I have pre-travel in this trigger. So when I make contact, I take out that pre-travel, and then I can make a conscious decision to let it go. Now, this is a very light trigger. It's probably a pound and a half at this point because it's really well worn in. But I'll tell you what, where this really plays a factor is long range.
Yeah.
When you get down in that position, and this is really all that matters, this last little bit, I want to have that control. I want to be able to under recoil when I'm firing those the shots 500, 600, 700 yards in a 3-gun match, the really hard ones. I want to be able to flip and press and come right back to that spot.
Because you know exactly where you are on the trigger in that case.
Exactly. Yes. This set is set up very similar to my 2011 triggers. I have that little bit of pre-travel, This would be very similar to one of my Akai custom guns. Just take up that little bit of pre-travel. I decide when the gun goes off, but then under recoil, I've got that little bit of slack in the trigger, so I can come right back to that spot.
So when you are pressing the trigger, I use the term accelerated pull on a rifle, and they're close. We're talking 10, 15, even 20 yards. You and I are probably running the rifle as fast as we can pull the trigger. You're just pressing right through that slack, meaning that staging or prep of the trigger doesn't matter because you're accelerated straight through.
Correct. Right. That's going to be this is the trigger speed. It's going to be as fast as I can get on it, because these guns, the way they're set up, they're made to be shot fast up close. I have a comp on the gun. It's a reduced power bolt carrier, reduced weight bolt carrier group, so it doesn't move a whole lot. Now you get out to distance, then I've got the 50-yard plate rack like we used to shoot in Three Gun Nation. Then that taking up the slack, prepping it, firing that controlled shot is much more important. And then obviously when we get into long range, and it comes down to processing speed at that point. So am I aimed in the right spot? I got to process that. Where am I at on this trigger? Got to process that. If I break the shot and it's windy day, and I see I don't get the reaction I want out of the target, but I see some dirt fly, I have to process that. And that time I'm resetting the trigger back to that spot so I can then fire another well-aimed shot, and be successful.
I love the concept of the processing, because when I'm prepping the trigger, and not to get ahead of myself here, but on the shots that we don't need the prep, we're accelerating straight through the trigger, those shots are so easy, it doesn't matter. Matter of fact, that's not the game changer. The game changer is the hard shots, like you said, the plate racks at 50 yards, or the 300 or 400 yard shots that you got to go 1 for 1 on the steel. That becomes incredibly important. Now, Ed asked a question earlier. I don't want to miss his question. He says, what is your preferred trigger weight specifically, or do you prefer a stock trigger? And maybe when you answer that question, you can distinguish between maybe what you carried on duty or think should be on duty, or a defensive gun, versus the fact that your competition triggers are probably crazy light.
Yeah, obviously the competition stuff, I want to have the best trigger possible, because every little bit of extra poundage you have to add to your trigger press is going to possibly result in moving the gun around. So I rifle, pistol, and shotgun, I want to have the best trigger I can get. Now on duty, I carried a 320 for the last few years, stock 320, probably one of the best triggers I've ever carried on duty. They're still pretty light. They're real crisp. The reset is good, and it was more than adequate for law enforcement purposes. At other times, I had carried different guns, but I found that one was probably the perfect one for my law enforcement purposes. Now, for like concealed carry and just my everyday gun, something like a 365, completely stock. Guns that I carried for self-defense, it's going to have a lot of pre-travel. It's going to have a nice smooth break, but it's going to be a stock one, because I don't mess around with modified triggers for guns I'm going to carry for self-defense.
Yeah, I love that. Now, so Alan Kelly asked a good question, and he said, do you see some people will let their finger walk to or past the first joint? So what I would assume that means is past that initial joint, and then the contact of the side of the finger and the gun could cause an accuracy issue. And for me, if I wrap around too deeply, I can squeeze the trigger and be like super accurate, but I can't reset it fast. But what are your thoughts on that happening, or do you see that happening, and do you correct that if you do?
Oh, 100%. So in the academy, we will get people of all different stature, and we will no doubt have a few guys that are just huge, have huge hands, and they're trying to find a spot on the trigger that works for them, and pretty soon trying to get the right grip causes their finger to go walk way in past the first joint, and then they start rubbing on that side, the right side for a right-hander. And I think it does affect accuracy. It's the same reason that I don't advocate putting the thumb of your support hand on the gun to use any pressure, because that pressure has to be offset by something else. And when I see people pressing down hard with their non-dominant hand, on the thumb on the frame, they have to compensate, and I start seeing the muscles in their forearm flex, trying to keep the gun straight because they're pushing on it. Equal opposite reaction has to take place if you're going to keep it on target. So if you get too deep and you start pushing and rubbing the frame, especially if you don't realize that's what's going on, you will have that same effect of pushing the gun around that you didn't intend.
Yeah, I love that. Hey, and folks, if you're joining me right now, Mike Seeklander, joined by Keith Garcia, we're talking about the holy grail of shooting, trigger control. And if you haven't shared this live stream, please share it or just tell someone that what we're doing, what we're talking about. Maybe a new shooter that you know, bring them on. Say, hey, you want to learn some things about trigger control? Listen to this expert, Keith Garcia. And I have another question for you, and this is from Jan Bailey Martin. Jan wants to know what drills you might recommend for increasing trigger speed or decreasing split times, and then take that wherever you want, because I think that we got through some of your initial trigger manipulation concepts, but we didn't go much farther than that.
So for me, the doubles drill, and Hashin Kim came up with this drill, and basically you pick a distance. And then you start off in the high ready or compress ready or ready gun position here.
Yeah,
and when you bring the gun up, you're going to fire 2 rounds as fast as you can. And you start at 5 yards, and then you'll maybe do 10 reps of that. You're going to look at the result on the target and see, okay, how, because I don't think splits aren't going to win you anything. Right. Being able to fire as fast as you can accurately is what's going to carry the day. So whether that's defensive or competition, being able to keep the gun on target under stress is going to be what's going to do it. So that doubles drill, starting off at 5, shooting it and seeing, okay, did I keep them all in the A? Is it pushing off left or right? Oh no, okay, let me go back to 7. Let me go back to 9. Let me go back to 12. And then understanding how fast you can pull the trigger at different distances is better than trying to pull the trigger fast, in my estimation.
Yeah, I love that. If you don't mind, I'm gonna add one thing and have you weigh on it, and then I want to have you show your grip. Sheila McKinney, I think I'm reading that right, wants to see your grip. But here in a second. But before that, if you're working that trigger speed type drill, I do the exact same thing for at least 2 rounds, and sometimes I'll add more shots, which allows me to test the structure, my upper body structure, my grip, and stuff like that. But would you agree with this? Good trigger control is also good grip control, because if I'm moving these supporting fingers while I'm pulling the trigger, I'm going to move the gun. So when you're doing a drill like that, you probably need to pay attention to the sensation in your hand, right? And make sure that you're not moving the gun when we're firing it. Would you agree with that?
100%. And we want to isolate the action of that trigger finger so we can keep the hand from moving around, the gun from moving around. One of the ways I found to do that is I will physically take my hand, just act like I'm pressing on the grip of the gun. Now I can do this pretty easily when there's no resistance, but what I'll do is I'll take a rubber band, I'll pull, I'll add some resistance, and then I'll check my grip. As I add more resistance, I see the grip start to break down. And that's basically what you're doing in trigger speed. So if you can add resistance and not see your hand movement, dramatic movement in your hand by adding resistance to your trigger finger, that's where you want to be. And the more resistance you can add without really having to make adjustments in your grip, the better off you're going to be.
Will you show your grip for Sheila asked about? She wants to see that, I think, where you're not pushing your thumb into the gun, which I don't either, because I'm clamping my palms together. Will you show that real quick?
So you're right. So when just like we talked about, when I grip the gun and say where you naturally clap your hands, ready gun position, I'm going to squeeze really hard with my non-dominant hand. So when I push the gun out, the base of both of the heels of my hands, the heels of my palms are going to work in together. And this is going to stop before I get to full extension. So I can't physically get to full extension because I don't want to. I don't want to cause problems with my joints. And I want to keep my elbows as my shock absorber. But what I do is I just keep my, if I had a 2011, my thumb would be on the safety or right over the safety. And my thumb is just physically off the gun. I don't press. This would be pressing down, trying to keep some pressure on that side. And I don't think it helps. I think what it does is physically pushes the gun back towards the strong hand, which I don't need. I want a strong wraparound grip around the gun. So that way the breakdown points are going to be less than if I have to accommodate for pushing the gun one way or the other with either my going in too deep with my trigger finger and pressing on the frame, or pushing on the any part of the. And I see people write their thumb actually on the frame of the gun and cause malfunctions, especially in the academy. You see some wear starting to happen here, and they'll slow down the slide to a point where it causes a problem with the gun functioning. Now, the reason I tell them not to do that, especially in law enforcement, is under stress, that grip that you've been practicing, that, I tell them to grip as hard as they can, right up to the point where the gun would shake. If you haven't been doing that and getting it dialed in under stress, you're gonna grip the gun even harder. And if you're pushing on the frame of the gun with your thumb, and unfortunately you get up into the slide, you're gonna cause a malfunction. And if you watch a lot of police shooting videos, say on YouTube, you will see a lot of malfunctions. Guys either aren't holding the gun properly, giving it enough inertia to recoil, or they're gripping and they're causing problems with the gun actually cycling and functioning.
Yeah, I love that. And Chris Mawale, I'm not sure, Chris, if I'm mispronouncing that, I'm sorry, forgive me. I'm not good at name pronunciation. He says, does the support hand help in making sure my trigger finger doesn't disturb his sights? So and we're not really talking about grip, but once again, good trigger control is good grip control. So you tell us a little bit about your support hand, Keith, and what your thoughts are there.
So the support hand 100% helps out with your trigger press, your trigger speed, because you get all this extra support. And the only thing I can tell you to demonstrate that is to go out and shoot the same drill, strong hand only, and then shoot it with a two-handed supported grip. You're going to see better results, faster, more accurate shots, because the gun isn't going to be moving around, and you can actually apply more pressure with the trigger finger and more speed. So yes, it absolutely helps. And when you get to the one-handed operation, whether it's strong or support hand, it's all about trigger press. You have to have gotten all the bugs out of your trigger press, or you're gonna see some real dramatic changes in accuracy.
Yeah, I always tell my students, this hand is always trying to move the gun. This hand is saying, stop moving. Yes. I'm moving. 100%. Stop moving.
100%.
Eventually, we need to learn how to stop moving with that hand as well for one-handed positions. But yeah, I like that as well. So, folks, if you're joining us live, we have a bunch of people watching right now. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mike Seeklander. I've got Keith Garcia on. We're talking about trick and trigger and grip and all kinds of things that mix together here. As well as how to improve your accuracy, how to increase your speed, and how to do all kinds of things like that. Let me see if I have any more questions. Oh, Eric Mejia is from, I think, an agency somewhere down near you. From a physical point, I've wondered if strengthening the finger extensors would help allow people to reset the trigger faster. That's an interesting question. So we're talking about the ability to move the finger faster. I don't know about that because I think the limiting factor in speed, Keith, maybe for you or I, physically would be our ability to move the finger out and push it to the rear again at speed. At the fastest we're shooting, maybe the really close targets. What are your thoughts on trigger finger extensor exercises?
I'm a big fan of overall grip strength and strengthening the grip. Everything from the elbows down is going to play a role in controlling the gun and helping you shoot faster because you're controlling the gun. In terms of increasing the speed, there are muscles, but they're not real big. So I don't know, you're not going to have turn it into some Hulk Hogan finger, but it's not going to hurt to have more strength. I don't know that it's going to give you more speed, but dexterity and movement and learning to control these three fingers, maybe taking those extenders and the hand exercisers and getting your grip established, and then seeing how much of a grip you can have and still keep the dexterity in your trigger finger. I think that's more important.
You said earlier that you don't think that splits are going to win the match. We're talking about the competitive type event. There are all these other things you have to be able to do. But out of curiosity, what are your splits on some different targets? If you throw those out there and maybe contrast those on different guns, because I would guess, your 365 carry gun, you may have different splits than your 2011, which is why you set it up with a trigger like that. And because for me, I find I have a limit of, if I get below a 16 split, that's incredibly fast. And more often than not, I'm shooting an 18 or 19 or a 20 split.
So with a rifle up close, I can get down into the 11s, 12s. And with
I
a
hate you.
handgun, I'm going to get.
I'm saying that formally. I hate you now, Keith. I hate you. You just said
But
11.
with a
You said
handgun,
11.
it's gonna
Okay.
it's gonna be 14, 15. It's not.
Okay.
For some
Yeah.
reason, it's slower. Maybe the trigger's a little bit longer, but those to me are great. Once you get out to 15, it's going to be you're 17, 18, 25. You're looking at 20, 21, 22, somewhere in there to make sure you're getting those hits. So again, respect for target size and distance. We're going to have to monitor how fast those splits can come, and the only way of knowing is by doing.
Yeah. Now, Vincent asked, do you always reprep the trigger as soon as the shot breaks, or does the reprep occur at a different point when moving the gun to another target? So trigger manipulation, but now a transition. Talk about that if you don't mind.
The same prep, as long as it's in a legal aspect. So if I've got target side by side, it's one presentation. I'm not moving from one port to another or something. Targets 2, 3, 4 feet apart. The trigger prep's going to be the same. So and it's going to occur right when ignition occurs.
So on a single target, you're prep. On two targets, you'd be prep.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Great stuff. By the way, Rick in Montana. Howdy from Montana. Is Rick Montana, is that your actual name, or is it Rick Montana on Facebook because you're from Montana? That's a great way. But welcome, Mr. Montana. So let me see what else I have. Dan Snyder, given the distances in rifle stages for 3-gun, can you talk about the relationship of what you see to managing your trigger? So the visual aspect.
Sure. So the trigger is set up exactly the same way on my rifle as my pistol. So I can manage it the same way. Now with a rifle, I can shoot faster and more accurately for further distances, right? So the same split that I have at a 10-yard target for my pistol, I'll have at a 50-yard target for my rifle. So I want to have it set up so I know the distances where I can run the trigger at speed, and then I know where I have to slow down to prep the trigger to make sure I'm getting giving the proper respect to target size and distance. That breakdown really occurs at 50 yards for me with the rifle and unmagnified at that point. Once you get out to greater distances, it's all about, again, processing speed. How fast does it take you? How fast can you get the appropriate sight picture on a target, prep that trigger, fire a shot, recognize whether or not it's been successful, and then if need be, fire another one. Now, prep going right to that reset, just like with a handgun, with a rifle at distance, will cut down that processing time.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. And we also have Anthony Duran. After prepping to the wall, should I creep a bit more until the actual wall, then break it? I'm not sure if he's kind of being humorous there. Because it's interesting you ask that, Anthony, because I have students all the time that are prepping, but they're not just fully prepping. They're going prepping, kind of creep. But Keith, weigh in on that a little bit.
I think, maybe what Anthony's talking about is there are most triggers, you're going to have the wall, and then say this is a stock 320. I can take it to the wall, and now, I feel another wall. And there's basically 1.5, 2 walls on this trigger. I can take it past that one. Now, am I going to feel that in the course of self-defense shooting? No. Am I going to feel that in a real accurate shot, a shot, 15-yard headshot or a 25-yard partial? I probably should, and hopefully I do. And well, I probably wouldn't be shooting this gun in that aspect, but I want to take it to the wall and make a conscious decision not to break the shot until I'm at the wall for those shots. If your gun has multiple stages, the more you take up, the more accurate and potentially successful you're going to be.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. All right, folks, we're talking to Keith Garcia about trigger control. We've talked about a little bit of everything at this point in time, from trigger control with the handgun to trigger control with the rifle. We're coming up on an hour, so I want to be respectful of this time. So if you have any other questions, throw them up there. And Keith, if you would kind of tie this all together, maybe kind of regurgitate the lessons that you want us to take away from this is in terms of trigger control. Maybe throw a couple drills or exercises out there you would like some of the shooters watching to do.
Absolutely. So again, once you get past the safety aspect, when you get to the range, the most important point for me is that the trigger management is done correctly. So what I'll do, even my own training, not training new people, when I'm going to go to the range, my first magazine is going to be done like this. When I come up to fire a shot, I'm going to physically, align the sights. I'm going to touch the trigger. I'm going to take out the slack, and I'm going to break the shot and come to reset. I want that all done very distinctively. So I'm feeling all the different parts of the trigger. I understand where the trigger's breaking, because there's another thing. As you wear these triggers in, they get better, and you might have a little bit different spot on the wall where the gun's going off. So it's always good to know what your gun's doing that day. So the first magazine, I'm going to be very distinct. I'm going to bring the gun up, sights aligned. I'm going to touch the trigger. I'm going to take out the slack. I'm going to break the shot. I'm going to reset the trigger. I'm going to index my finger. I'm going to come back to ready gun or the holster, depending on what I want to work on. But I'm going to go through that whole process for the first magazine. And I'm going to do that at 25 yards, and I'm going to try and shoot as tight a group as I can.
Interesting. Okay. What next?
Then I'm going to, I really like the doubles drill, and I do it with both my handgun and my rifle. So I will usually start, because I know I can shoot doubles at 5, 7, 10. So I'll start usually about 12 yards, and I'll come up. And again, this is a way of, if you're testing new gear, or if you got a new load for your handgun, or you put a spring in it, and you're trying to evaluate what's going on each time, it's a constant process. So you want to be evaluating your gear. So at that point, I'm going to do a doubles drill for a couple magazines. I'm going to pick a distance or two, and I'm going to drive the gun up. And as soon as I get an acceptable sight picture, I'm going to take the slack out of the trigger, prep it, and I'm going to fire 2 rounds as fast as I can. At that point, I'm going to come off the trigger, come back on it, break the shot, a controlled pair, and I'm going to do that for a magazine. And I'm going to look at the results and see, okay, is my accuracy acceptable for this target size and distance? Yes or no? What am I doing right or wrong? Then I'm going to, if it's good for that distance, and I don't need to work on anything at 12 yards, I'll go back to 15 and do the same thing. And if it's good there, I'll go back to 17, because I want to know in terms of predicted pairs, what's the distance on this target that I can run the gun, 99% of the time. If I do my job right, I'm going to get those 2 shots in the A zone, acceptable sight picture, target size and distance, and get my hits.
Yeah. And do you repeat these types of drills in pretty much every practice session, and then move on to specific focus for that session?
Yes. Yeah. I'm going to start off doing this because you're looking at your recoil management.
Sure.
In the second, the doubles drill is all about recoil management. So for me, combining the trigger press and then adding the recoil management aspect of it, firing that second shot, to me, if there's anything breaking down in your grip or your trigger management, it's going to come out right there. And you need to address that really before you go on and work on other things. I always tell people, before you shoot a drill at speed, shoot the drill, because 3-gun will set up stuff that's very technical or very difficult or longer shots. Make sure your gun is capable of making the shot. Make sure you're capable of making the shot before you get the timer out and start doing it at speed. Because if your gun or your skill level isn't to that point yet, it's just going to lead to frustration, because you're trying to shoot fast, but you're not learning anything because you're not making the shots.
Yeah. And Alan Kelly asks a great question. Do you think that a few rounds of dry fire prior to your live fire practice is a good idea?
100%. So just for instance, at the academy where I work, we'll have 4 different ranges going on at a time. And when the students get to my range, they know by day 3 or so of this 3-week process we go through, that they're going to get up on the line. No matter what they were doing with the other ranges, they're going to unload, and they're going to give me 25 perfect dry fire reps before we do anything.
I love that at the start, and honestly, maybe at the end as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Especially when I'll do one-handed operation with them, and, strong and support hand, they're having to clear type 1 and double feeds. And they really start getting into the hammer and the trigger because they're not used to doing this stuff. I make them slow down at that point, come back and do dry fire at the end. because that way they're pulling it all in. They're not leaving the range with all these bad, habits of slapping the trigger.
Sure. Okay, so one more question, and then I'm going to let you tell everybody where they can find you, or if you have a website or want to hire you for a class. So here's the question for you. When are we going to see you on LiveFire?
I would love to come out. I'm in California, so it'll be a little bit of a journey out there, but I'd be happy to come out and shoot with you guys and come to the studio. It'd be a great time.
Cool.
So,
well, we'll have you out. We'll have you right here physically with me. We could work on trigger control, grip, rifle positioning, and whatever else. And we'll get you on the app as well, so you can show us some of your drills or maybe comment on some of the folks that are on there. So thanks very much, folks. Keith, tell people where they can find you, where your website is, classes, anything you want to tell them about stuff you got coming up.
So first, let me just say thank you, Mike. It's been an honor being the first live guest on the stream. I really appreciate you bringing me on. And thank you to all the viewers and the great questions. My website was supposed to be done yesterday, but if anybody's dealt with web designers, it's a little bit unpredictable. So LTAC, Libra Training Consulting, is the website will be up soon, hopefully this week. But in the meantime, on Facebook, on Instagram, I'm Keith Garcia 3Gun. On Facebook, it's just Keith Garcia. And my email is keith.garcia343 at gmail.com. And I'm getting out there and I'm doing some tactical 2-gun classes. I can do competition classes, rifle, pistol alone. I think people, especially in the law enforcement community right now, and civilians are liking the aspect of using a carbine and a pistol in the same class. So got a ton of information I'm trying to get out there for people using both platforms and going back and forth between the two. So I'm really looking forward to teaching a lot of classes in that respect. So please hit me up if you have a range or access to one and you want to host a class. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Cool. Thank you very much. You were a fantastic first guest. I appreciate you taking the time. I know we went a little bit over an hour. I thought it would be closer to an hour. So thank you so much for sharing your information. We've known each other for a long time, and I have a lot of respect for you. So I certainly appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. Folks, make sure you find Keith. Check out his website. Hire him for a class. I put my personal stamp of approval on him, of course. He's a great guy and a great instructor as well. We will get Keith sometime in the near future on the LiveFire app. So if you find him on LiveFire, give him a follow. If you don't follow me, if you're watching this, follow me on LiveFire as well. Send me a message, and then I will follow you back. Like I said, we're doing weekly programming and a bunch of other really cool stuff. Now, of course, as you know, these live streams are Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Central right now. We're constantly looking at feedback from you on better times and days. So if you're like, Mike, I'd rather be on Wednesday evening, Wednesday night at the range, or Tuesdays and Thursdays, or a morning show and an afternoon show, type it in the comments, give us some feedback, send us an email at LiveFire if you want to, and let us know when the best times for you, and thank you for viewing. Of course, if you shared this, thank you for sharing. Right now, next live stream's show is Tuesday at 1 p.m. Central Time. And I think we're getting close to covering some rifle stuff. I'm not really sure. So that's all I have, folks. Thank you so much. Thanks to Keith for joining us. And until then,